They swore it would just be one night, a mistake lost in the rain and city lights. But when dawn came, neither of them could forget the touch that changed everything. What happens when two hearts cross a line they can never return from? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more unforgettable BL stories. The city streets gleamed with a mixture of rain and neon lights. Lanterns swayed gently in the evening breeze, their reflections shimmering across puddles left from the afternoon storm. It was the kind of night that felt like it belonged in a dream, where every shadow could hide a secret, or a spark. Luke darted through the festival crowd, a small grin playing on his lips. His hoodie was damp from the drizzle, strands of dark hair plastered to his forehead. He had come seeking distraction, something to pull him out of the monotony of his days. The festival, alive with laughter, music, and the scent of roasted corn, seemed perfect for that. But the crowd was thicker than he'd expected. He weaved through groups of people, careful not to bump into anyone, or so he thought. A sudden misstep sent him stumbling into a solid wall of calm presence. Luke yelped, his backpack slipping from his shoulder. Trinkets, a small collection of handmade charms, spilled across the wet cobblestones. I'm so sorry, he stammered, crouching down to gather the scattered items. Careful, a deep, steady voice said, calm yet laced with subtle irritation. Luke looked up. The man before him was tall, lean, and composed, with dark eyes that seemed to observe everything yet betrayed nothing. His hair was neatly combed back, and his crisp jacket suggested he didn't belong to the chaos of the festival. Luke felt a strange jolt in his chest, an electric pull that made him flush. Luke struggled to find words, holding out a charm with a trembling hand. Here, this one's yours? The man raised an eyebrow, glancing at the charm. Then he extended a gloved hand and Luke's fingers brushed against his. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but enough to send a small shiver through Luke. I'm Richard, the man said, voice measured but not unkind. Luke, he replied, trying to sound casual, though his heartbeat betrayed him. Richard knelt slightly to help pick up a few of the trinkets Luke hadn't managed to grab. Luke noticed the precision in every movement, the way Richard's hands worked efficiently yet with care. Something about that meticulous attention made Luke's chest tighten in an unfamiliar way. You're in a rush, Richard noted, straightening up and handing him the last charm. Something like that, Luke said with a shrug, brushing rain off his hoodie. He offered a lopsided grin. Crowds aren't really my thing. Richard's lips quirked, just the faintest hint of amusement. You say that, but here you are running through them? Luke laughed, a sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. Maybe I just like a little chaos now and then. Richard's gaze lingered on him, steady and unwavering. There was something in that look, a mix of caution and curiosity, that Luke couldn't quite read. And yet he found himself wanting to. Careful where you run next, Richard said finally, a subtle warning hidden beneath his composed tone. Not everyone is as forgiving as I am. Luke's grin widened, playful and daring. I'll take my chances. For a moment the festival noise seemed to fade. They stood there, two strangers connected by a few seconds, a fleeting touch and a shared breath of anticipation. Luke felt his heart thud louder than necessary, and he could see a flicker of something unspoken in Richard's dark eyes. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the moment passed. Luke glanced down at his scattered charms, then back at Richard, who was already turning away. He opened his mouth to say something, maybe a joke, maybe an invitation, but the words caught in his throat. Richard disappeared into the crowd, the lamplight catching the edges of his jacket, making him look like a figure from a dream. Luke felt a strange emptiness in his chest, a pull that refused to be ignored. He shook his head, muttering to himself, crazy? Why do I feel like I just met trouble? And yet, Luke knew this was no ordinary meeting. There had been a spark, fleeting and fragile, but undeniable. Something told him he hadn't seen the last of Richard. As he walked through the festival, collecting the rest of his things, he couldn't stop stealing glances at the crowd, half expecting to see those dark, observant eyes again. Every laugh, every flicker of lantern light seemed to carry the memory of that brief touch. The rain slowed, leaving the streets slick and shiny under the festival lights. Luke kept moving, but a part of him lingered, tangled in the memory of a stranger who had already left an imprint on his heart. That night Luke didn't just walk through a festival. He walked through the first stirrings of something dangerous, something thrilling, something he wasn't sure he was ready to stop. The festival had ended, leaving the city streets quiet except for the occasional clatter of stray vendors packing up. The lanterns that once danced across puddles now glowed faintly, casting a soft orange hue on the pavement. The night smelled of wet asphalt, roasted corn, and distant fireworks. Richard walked along the river path near the park, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. The river reflected the city lights, a ribbon of gold and silver snaking through the dark. He was supposed to feel relief after a long night of work. After all, the festival had been hectic. But he couldn't shake the memory of the boy who had bumped into him, spilled a bag of charms, and vanished into the crowd. The name slipped into his mind like a song he didn't remember learning, but one he couldn't forget. Richard hadn't thought much about strangers recently. He prided himself on keeping distance. But there was something about that playful, reckless energy that refused to leave him alone. He found himself stopping mid-step, leaning over the railing of the river, staring at the rippling water. And then, unexpectedly, a familiar voice broke the silence. "Well, fancy seeing you here." Richard turned sharply. Luke was leaning against a nearby lamppost, hood down, a half-smile tugging at his lips. His dark hair was damp, sticking to his forehead, and his eyes glimmered with mischief and curiosity. Luke's presence seemed to pull at the night itself, and Richard felt an uncharacteristic flutter in his chest. What are you doing here?" Richard asked, trying to keep his tone neutral, though it came out more tense than intended. Luke shrugged casually, though there was a sparkle in his eyes that suggested he wasn't being entirely honest. "Could ask you the same thing. Thought I'd find some peace after the chaos." His gaze flicked to the river, then back to Richard. "Looks like you found the quiet spot first." Richard considered telling him to leave, but the words caught in his throat. Something about Luke's presence was magnetic, impossible to resist. "I just needed to clear my head," he said finally, his voice quieter than he intended. Luke took a step closer, their shoulders almost brushing. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, tone casual, but the intensity in his eyes made it clear it wasn't a question. Richard hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, just don't fall in." Luke laughed softly, the sound warm and infectious. "I promise no falling tonight." But the twinkle in his eyes suggested otherwise. They walked side by side along the riverbank, the silence stretching comfortably between them. Luke was the first to break it, pointing at a small group of floating lanterns. "See that? People make wishes, you know. Fancy trying one?" Richard glanced at the lanterns. They were tiny paper vessels glowing softly, drifting slowly down the river. He shook his head. "I don't make wishes." Luke smirked. "Sure you do. Everyone has something they're secretly hoping for." Richard frowned slightly, debating whether to respond. Luke, of course, noticed and leaned a little closer, shoulder brushing his. "You don't have to tell me," he murmured. "I just like guessing." The closeness made Richard aware of Luke's warmth, the subtle scent of his damp hair, the faint cologne that lingered like a whisper. He swallowed, trying to focus on the lanterns, on the gentle flow of the river, on anything that would keep him from noticing the fluttering in his chest. "You're different from everyone else I meet," Richard said finally, his voice low, almost hesitant. Luke tilted his head, curiosity lighting up his features. "Different good or different bad?" Richard's lips twitched at the corners. "Good," he admitted, though he tried to keep his tone flat. Luke grinned, the kind of grin that could light up dark streets. "I'll take it. And you're interesting too, you know. Calm, reserved, but not boring. That's a rare combo." Richard felt heat rise to his cheeks. He had never been called interesting in a way that felt like a compliment rather than an observation. And now, with Luke standing so close, smiling like the city itself conspired with him, he felt vulnerable in a way he wasn't used to. They continued walking, sharing stories, not the trivial, surface-level kind, but pieces of themselves. Luke spoke of restless nights, unfinished sketches, and the thrill of small adventures. Richard shared glimpses of his life as a security assistant, the pressures he felt, and the quiet moments he cherished. Each story, each laugh, each small confession drew them closer, though neither wanted to admit it aloud. At one point, Luke stumbled slightly on a slick patch of pavement. Richard caught him instinctively, his hands landing on Luke's waist. Their eyes met, wide and unblinking. The river reflected the city lights, the lanterns drifting lazily, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. Luke's breath hitched and Richard felt a pull he couldn't name. "Careful," he said, though his voice was softer now, almost intimate. Luke smirked, leaning slightly into the touch. "Don't worry. I like a little danger." The moment stretched. Their shoulders touched, their arms almost brushed, and the air around them seemed to thrum with unspoken tension. Richard found himself imagining what it would feel like if Luke leaned closer, if their lips met. He chastised himself silently, but the thought wouldn't leave him. They walked until the lanterns grew sparse, until the river widened and the night felt endless. Luke's hand brushed against Richard's almost by accident, or maybe not. Richard froze for a second, feeling warmth spread through him at the contact. Luke noticed immediately, grinning knowingly, though he said nothing. Finally, they reached a quiet bend in the river, where the city's hum was distant and the lights flickered gently across the water. Luke leaned against the railing, looking out at the reflection. Richard stood beside him, unsure if he should leave or stay, feeling the pull of something he didn't fully understand. "You know," Luke said, breaking the silence, "I like nights like this. Something about the quiet makes everything sharper. You notice things you wouldn't during the day." Richard glanced at him, his chest tightening. "I notice you," he said before he could stop himself. Luke's eyes widened slightly, then a slow, teasing smile spread across his face. "Oh, is that so?" Richard felt heat rising to his ears, and the words hung in the night air, fragile but electric. Luke's gaze softened for just a second, and Richard realized he needed, to stay here with him even if only a little longer. The night pressed on, full of whispered confessions, quiet laughter, and glances that lingered too long. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt something uncontainable, a pull toward someone else, reckless and thrilling and entirely new. When Luke finally stood to leave, the spell of the night lingered. "I'll see you again," he said, voice low and teasing, eyes sparkling with unspoken promise. Richard nodded, watching him disappear down the path. The river reflected his own racing thoughts, questions, curiosities, and the undeniable pull of someone who had, in a single night, made his world feel brighter and infinitely more dangerous. And as he turned to head home, Richard realized he didn't want to stop thinking about Luke. Not yet. The city skyline stretched before them, a constellation of lights reflecting off glass towers, neon signs, and the river far below. Up here, on the secluded rooftop, the noise of the streets felt distant, as if the world existed only for them. Luke leaned against the railing, eyes tracing the glittering horizon. The night air tugged playfully at his hair, and he let out a long, almost mischievous sigh. "See? Told you I had a spot worth escaping to." Richard stood beside him, tense, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. He had followed Luke here without hesitation, despite the uncertainty that gnawed at him. And now, standing on the rooftop with the city sprawling beneath them, he felt the pull of something both reckless and irresistible. Why did you bring me here?" Richard asked quietly, though the question was laced with curiosity. Luke turned to face him, a slow smile playing on his lips. "Because some things deserve to be outside the ordinary. Because some nights," his voice dropped, soft and intimate, "deserve to be remembered." Richard's breath caught. There was something in Luke's eyes, fierce, daring, and tender all at once, that made his heart thump against his ribs. He had tried to ignore it, tried to stay cautious, but Luke's presence made restraint feel impossible. The space between them shrank almost by itself. Luke stepped closer, just a few inches, enough that Richard could feel the warmth radiating from him. "You've been quiet tonight," Luke said, his tone teasing but edged with sincerity. "Thinking too much, huh?" Richard swallowed, his throat dry. I'm trying not to get carried away." Luke tilted his head, studying him. "Or maybe you are." Richard's pulse quickened. The teasing, the closeness, the night itself, everything was conspiring against his restraint. He had tried to deny it, tried to keep his emotions neatly contained, but Luke had cracked open the shell he'd built around himself. And then Luke reached out, fingers brushing lightly against Richard's hand. The contact was electric. Richard froze, feeling warmth surge through his chest. He wanted to pull back, to remind himself of boundaries, but the pull of desire was stronger than caution. Luke leaned in closer, the faint scent of rain and something uniquely him washing over Richard. "You don't have to fight it," Luke whispered, lips just inches from his. Richard's breath hitched. For a moment all thought vanished. There was only Luke, only the night, only the magnetic pull that refused to let go. He felt himself leaning forward, drawn into a gravity he couldn't resist. Their lips met in a hesitant, searching kiss at first, soft and unsure. Richard's hands trembled slightly as they rested against Luke's chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart. Luke deepened the kiss, tilting his head, pressing closer, until the world outside the rooftop seemed to dissolve into the city lights and the rush of adrenaline. Luke pulled back just enough to murmur against Richard's lips, "I've wanted this, for a long time." Richard's chest tightened. "Me too," he admitted, barely above a whisper before Luke captured his lips again, fiercer this time, urgent and desperate. The night stretched around them, the wind tangling their hair, the city glittering beneath them, a silent witness to the reckless abandon they allowed themselves. Every brush of fingers, every press of lips, every whispered sigh drew them closer, tangled them together. They moved as if the rooftop, the city, and the night itself had conspired to give them this moment, a night without rules or hesitation. Luke's hands traced the line of Richard's jaw, fingers slipping into his hair. Richard responded instinctively, wrapping his arms around Luke's waist, holding on as if letting go would mean losing this entirely. Their breaths mingled, hearts thundering in unison, the night air thick with desire and heat. The kiss broke briefly, only to allow for gasping breaths, murmured names, and a shared laugh that was half exhaustion, half joy. The playful teasing from before had melted into something deeper, something raw, something wholly theirs. Luke rested his forehead against Richard's, breath ragged. "I don't want this night to end," he confessed, voice low and earnest. "I don't want to stop." Richard's hands tightened around him. "Neither do I," he admitted. And in that instant they didn't. They moved closer, exploring the line between restraint and surrender. The night blurred around them, the lights of the city flickering like stars in the distance. The thrill of giving in to each other was intoxicating, a dangerous, beautiful freedom neither had anticipated. Minutes, or was it hours? Passed in a haze of stolen kisses, whispered promises, and the quiet laughter that only two people utterly captivated by each other could share. When they finally broke apart, breathless and flushed, the world felt suspended. Richard leaned against Luke's shoulder, eyes closed, trying to catch his breath. Luke's hand rested over his, firm and grounding, and for the first time in a long while, Richard felt completely untethered, in the best way possible. You're insane," Richard said softly, a smile tugging at his lips. Luke chuckled, pressing his forehead once more against Richard's. "Maybe. But you like it." Richard didn't answer with words. Instead, he let his hand squeeze Luke's, a silent acknowledgement of the chaos they had willingly stepped into, a promise that neither wanted to return to the world of caution just yet. The night lingered around them, electric and infinite. Luke rested his head on Richard's shoulder, eyes closed, a rare moment of stillness settling between them. Richard allowed himself to relax, letting go of the doubts, the fear, the need for control. This night, this reckless, unforgettable night, was theirs. When the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, painting the city in pale gold, they finally pulled apart just enough to look at each other. The adrenaline of the night hadn't faded entirely, but in its place was something softer, tender and unspoken. "We should probably get down," Richard said, voice still thick with awe and disbelief. Luke smiled, brushing a damp strand of hair from Richard's forehead. "Yeah, but we'll always have this night." Richard nodded, heart still racing, and they began to make their way to the rooftop exit. Hands brushed, lingering touches passed, and every glance carried the memory of the hours they had surrendered to one another. That night, neither Luke nor Richard had stopped. They had forgotten rules, forgotten fear, forgotten hesitation. And when the world came back into focus with the morning light, they would have to face it. But for now, the memory of the night they forgot to stop burned brightly between them. A promise, a thrill, and the beginning of something neither could deny. The first light of dawn seeped over the city, soft and golden, spilling into the rooftop where Luke and Richard sat side by side. The night had given way to quiet morning, the chaos of their passion replaced with a fragile, intimate stillness. Luke leaned back against the railing, arms stretched out behind him, and let out a long, contented sigh. The city below was waking slowly, faint sounds of traffic, birds stirring in the distance, windows opening as people greeted the day. But up here, in their secluded world above the streets, time seemed to stretch, unhurried and tender. Richard, sitting close beside him, kept his hands folded loosely in his lap. His gaze wandered over the cityscape, but he couldn't keep his mind off Luke. The night they had shared replayed endlessly in his head. The reckless kisses, the laughter, the way Luke had pulled him into a world where boundaries didn't exist. He had expected regret to follow, but instead, his chest was heavy with warmth and anticipation. "You're quiet this morning," Luke said softly, eyes flicking to him. His voice, usually so teasing, carried a gentle weight that made Richard's stomach tighten. "I'm thinking," Richard admitted, hesitating. "About last night, about us." Luke's grin softened, becoming almost vulnerable. "Good thinking or bad thinking?" Richard met his gaze, honest and hesitant. "I don't know. But I know I don't regret it." Luke tilted his head, letting the wind play through his hair. "Neither do I. But," His voice faltered slightly, rare for someone usually so confident. It changes things, doesn't it? Richard nodded, feeling the gravity of those words. It did change things. Last night wasn't just a fleeting thrill. It was the beginning of something deeper, something they could either let fade, or let grow. He turned slightly to face Luke, taking a deep breath. I was scared, he confessed, voice low. Scared of feeling this way. Scared of losing control. But his hand brushed against Luke's, lingering, warm and grounding. I don't want to stop feeling this. Luke's expression softened further, a mix of relief and something tender swirling in his eyes. Neither do I, he whispered. His thumb brushed across the back of Richard's hand, a gesture full of unspoken promise. You make it easy to want things I never thought I'd want. Richard felt heat rise to his cheeks, but the warmth wasn't just embarrassment, it was hope. Hope that whatever they had begun could survive the sunlight, survive the return to reality. So, what do we do now? He asked quietly. Luke considered for a moment, then leaned closer, forehead resting gently against Richard's. We take it slow, he said, voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. We figure out what we want, together. Richard exhaled, a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Together, he repeated, letting the words settle. It felt right, like stepping into a space he had always longed for but never allowed himself. The city below continued its quiet awakening, but up here, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. Luke's hand found Richard's, fingers intertwining naturally, as if they had always belonged together. Richard felt a shiver of reassurance run through him, the kind that comes when you know without question that someone sees you and still wants to stay. They sat in silence for a while, watching the sunrise stretch across the horizon. The sky transformed from soft pinks to warm oranges, reflecting off the glass towers, the river, and the streets below. Richard's head rested lightly against Luke's shoulder, and Luke's arm draped over him protectively, a silent acknowledgement of the closeness they now shared. I've never done this before, Richard admitted, voice muffled against Luke's jacket. Felt so sure about someone so quickly. Luke chuckled softly. Neither have I. But maybe that's the point. Sometimes you just know. His fingers tightened around Richard's hand. And when you know, you hold on. Richard lifted his head to meet Luke's gaze, the sunlight catching the glimmer in his dark eyes. Then I'm holding on, he said, firm but gentle. Luke's smile widened, warmth radiating from him like the morning sun. Good. Because I'm not letting go either. They shared a quiet laugh, the kind that comes from relief, joy, and the comforting knowledge that neither was alone. The night had tested their boundaries, revealed desires and unraveled fears, but morning brought clarity. Together they had faced the recklessness of the night and emerged stronger, more connected than ever. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt free, not free of responsibility or caution but free to be himself, to explore this new chapter without fear. Luke had become more than a spark in the shadows. He was a steady flame, unpredictable yet grounding, daring yet safe. And in that realization Richard found a calm strength. Luke's gaze drifted back to the horizon, but his hand remained firmly clasped around Richard's. Promise me something, he said softly. Richard raised an eyebrow. What? Promise me we'll be honest, Luke said, eyes locking onto his. No holding back, no pretending. Even when it's hard. Richard nodded, squeezing his hand. I promise. You too. Luke's lips curved into a satisfied smile. Good. Because I think we're just getting started. The city continued to wake below them, but up here, there was only the quiet intimacy between two people who had dared to leap and found each other in midair. The memory of the night they had forgotten to stop lingered between them, not as guilt but as a foundation. A reminder of desire, of connection, and of the courage it took to surrender to what they both wanted. They stood together, leaning against the railing, hands intertwined. The breeze tugged playfully at their clothes and hair, but neither moved to pull away. Instead, they let it carry them, savoring the moment of vulnerability, the warmth, and the unspoken promise of what was to come. Ready to face the day? Luke asked finally, a hint of mischief returning to his tone. Richard smiled, the tension of uncertainty eased into something lighter, something hopeful. Yeah, he said, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. As long as we face it together. Luke squeezed his hand one last time, eyes sparkling. Together? He echoed. And with that, they turned to descend from the rooftop, stepping into the morning light side by side, hearts aligned, ready to face whatever came next, together, fearless and unafraid to chase the moments that made life unforgettable. For Luke and Richard, The night they had forgotten to stop wasn't just a memory. It was the beginning of a story neither would ever want to end.